The haunted asylum where patients never left, the forgotten place. They say the air itself carries memories, a cold, oppressive weight that presses down on your chest the moment you step across the threshold. But what if those memories are not just echoes of the past, but a living, breathing torment that clings to the present like a shadow? The old asylum looms like a bruise on the landscape, its jagged silhouette cutting through the horizon with a kind of cruel finality. Built in the late 1800s, the St. Dymphna Asylum was once touted as a beacon of progress, a place where the mad, the broken, and the abandoned could be healed. Its red brick walls and sprawling grounds were meant to offer sanctuary from a world that had no place for the lost. But there is a sickness that runs deeper than any patient's fractured mind, something that seeped into the very bones of the building, twisting what was meant to heal into something far darker. The hospital's history is not written in sterile medical records or charitable accolades. It's carved into the stone walls by trembling hands, etched into the floors by the scuffling of feet dragging chains. Most asylums from that era have long been condemned or converted into luxury apartments where the wealthy sleep blissfully unaware of the suffering once endured, where they now sip cocktails. But St. Dymphna remains stubbornly untouched. Some say it's the asbestos, others claim it's the structural instability. But the locals will tell you something different. They'll speak of the flickering lights seen from the crumbling windows at night, long after the last of the staff abandoned the place. They'll whisper about the sounds that echo from the old patient wards, wails and groans, the desperate sobbing of someone pleading for mercy. They'll tell you about the few brave souls who dared to venture inside, only to come stumbling out, white-faced and shivering, unwilling to speak of what they'd seen. But the truth is worse than the stories. It's not the ghosts of the dead that haunt St. Dymphna Asylum. It's the echoes of the living, the patients who never truly left. The hospital's population swelled in the early 1900s, particularly during the Great Depression, when the country's social safety nets frayed to the breaking point. Families who couldn't afford to care for their mentally ill or even mildly troubled relatives sent them away to places like St. Dymphna. Some were nothing more than teenagers struggling with grief or melancholy. Others were women whose only affliction was daring to challenge their husband's authority. The treatments were experimental, the care brutal. Electroshock therapy administered with barbaric regularity. Ice pick lobotomies performed without anesthesia. Hydrotherapy used as both punishment and cure. The philosophy of care was not one of compassion, but control, to make the mind submit to the world's cold, mechanical order, and if that failed, to silence it altogether. The worst of the hospital's reputation was cemented in the 1930s when a doctor by the name of Henry Cartwright took over the psychiatric wing. Cartwright was a man of contradictions, brilliant but twisted, compassionate in theory but sadistic in practice. His obsession with understanding the nature of madness led him to perform hideous experiments under the guise of treatment. He believed the key to sanity lay in breaking the patient's identity down to nothing, then rebuilding it from the ashes. His methods were horrific. Patients were deprived of food and sleep, isolated for days in dark, stifling cells. Some were locked in water tanks for hours, their screams muffled by the icy embrace of water. Those who resisted were subjected to beatings so severe that their bodies bore the scars until death finally claimed them. But the most disturbing stories are about the patients who were never discharged. Official records claim they simply died from complications or natural causes. Yet the locals believe something far more sinister occurred. They claim Cartwright kept them there, not as patients, but as specimens. Some say he locked them away in the hospital's lower levels, where the air is thick with mold and rot, the darkness so absolute it feels like being buried alive. When Cartwright himself vanished in 1942, the staff who remained were too relieved to question where he'd gone. Some believed he had descended into madness himself, swallowed whole by the very darkness he'd tried to tame. Others said he was taken by the spirits of those he had tormented, dragged down into the abyss as a final act of vengeance. But the truth was never found, and perhaps never will be. Now, the asylum stands as a monument to cruelty, disguised as healing. Its empty halls still carry the echoes of those who once walked them, both patient and predator alike. The question is not whether the place is haunted, but by what and by whom. The haunted asylum where patients never left. Echoes of the damned. No one dares enter the lower levels of St. Dymphna Asylum. Those who have attempted it often return with hollow eyes, stammering about whispers that slithered into their ears when no one else was around. Others claim they heard footsteps pacing the hallways, slow and deliberate, like the maddening drip of water in a silent room. But those are the lucky ones. There are also those who have gone down the stairs and never returned. And the ones who do come back, sometimes their minds do not. The townspeople have tried to erase St. Dymphna from memory. Local authorities have boarded up the entrances multiple times, but the barriers are always broken. Rumors swirl about strange groups holding midnight rituals in the asylum's chapel, their chanting voices weaving through the air like venom. Those who leave offerings of flowers or coins claim it's to appease whatever lingers there. And always there are those who swear they've seen figures moving through the windows at night, pale, shadowy forms that flicker like distorted images on an old television screen. But the real horror lies in the documentation that was never meant to be found. Years ago, a historian named Marcus Finch made it his life's work to uncover the truth of what happened within those walls. For months, he sifted through old records, police reports, and dusty files scattered throughout the county's archives. What he discovered was enough to chill even the most skeptical investigator. The files were incomplete, many of them damaged or deliberately altered. But Finch managed to piece together enough of the story to understand the monstrous nature of what had occurred. Over 300 patients admitted during Cartwright's reign were never officially discharged or declared dead. They were simply erased. Finch uncovered reports of sealed rooms, their doors bolted from the outside, rooms where claw marks had been scratched into the walls and floors, rooms where the very air stank of blood and decay. He found photographs taken by former staff members, grainy black and white images of skeletal figures with eyes too large and vacant, mouths twisted in silent terror. Some were strapped to rusted gurneys, their limbs contorted in ways that should have been impossible. Others lay on the cold floors, bodies distorted beyond recognition. But what disturbed Finch most were the accounts of the patients themselves. Those who somehow managed to escape spoke of a place where time lost all meaning, of rooms that twisted and reshaped themselves as if the asylum itself were alive and feeding on their fear. Some claimed to see things that could not exist, impossible creatures writhing just beneath the surface of reality, their voices beckoning them deeper into madness. The survivors' testimonies were so consistent, so vivid, that Finch could not dismiss them as mere delusions. They described sounds that did not belong to this world, a low, guttural hum that rattled their bones, laughter that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, the distant clanging of metal like the forging of chains. And worse than the sounds were the voices that spoke in dead tongues, their words both comforting and horrific, voices that made promises of freedom, but only if the listener surrendered completely to the darkness. The more Finch uncovered, the more the lines between reality and insanity blurred. His once steady hands trembled whenever he opened a new file, half expecting the papers to bleed or the ink to shift into incomprehensible symbols. But even as his obsession grew, he could not stop. The truth was a poisoned gift, a festering wound he had to probe, no matter how much it hurt. And as his mind unraveled, he began to understand why so many who had delved into the asylum's secrets ended up destroyed by them. What Finch could not reconcile was the fact that the hospital's atrocities were not merely the result of one man's madness. The cruelty was systemic, woven into the very fabric of the institution. The doctors and nurses who remained after Cartwright's disappearance continued their own brand of brutal care, as if the evil had been passed on like a disease. Finch published his findings in a small, poorly funded journal, his claims quickly dismissed by the scientific community. He was labeled a fraud, a man driven mad by his own morbid curiosity, and perhaps they were right. Shortly after his publication, Finch himself vanished. Some say he was taken by whatever malevolence still lingers in St. Dymphna. Others believe he succumbed to madness and took his own life. His house was found abandoned, his research scattered across the floor like the frantic scrawling of a lunatic. But even now, his words persist. His grim revelations whispered about in forums and late-night radio shows, where the curious and the desperate gather to discuss the forbidden. Because the truth has a way of seeping into the minds of those who seek it. Like a parasite, it burrows into the brain, spreading doubt and fear. And once it takes root, there is no escaping it. The only question that remains is whether Finch discovered the truth, or if the truth simply consumed him. The haunted asylum where patients never left, the descent into madness. The pull of St. Dymphna Asylum is like gravity, a black hole of obsession that draws the desperate and the curious alike. Despite the county's best efforts to keep the structure sealed off, the place has become a haven for thrill seekers, paranormal investigators, and those with personal ties to the institution's grim past. Some arrive armed with electromagnetic field meters and thermal cameras, their faces aglow with both fear and excitement. Others come with nothing but trembling hands and fractured memories, searching for proof that their loved one's suffering was not merely a product of their own minds. And then there are those who come to St. Dymphna seeking answers to questions no one should ever ask. One such visitor was Evelyn Torres, a former psychiatric nurse turned investigator after her younger brother, Daniel, was committed to the asylum during its final, chaotic days. His condition had been mild, episodes of depression and anxiety hardly deserving of a place like St. Dymphna. But the asylum had been convenient, a place to hide away the unwanted and the inconvenient. Daniel's letters started out sporadic but coherent. Descriptions of long days spent in isolation, the heavy silence broken only by the occasional distant scream. He spoke of doctors who didn't listen, nurses who moved through the halls like phantoms, their faces expressionless and cold. But soon, his words grew disjointed, his handwriting fractured and wild. He wrote of creatures that walked the halls at night, their eyes like molten silver, their voices like fractured glass. He wrote of whispers that filled his mind even in sleep, of rooms that twisted and melted as if the asylum itself were an organism feeding on his sanity. And then, nothing. Evelyn's pleas to the administration went unanswered. Her visits to the asylum were denied by stone-faced guards who told her Daniel was no longer available for visitation. Desperation turned into obsession, her life consumed by the need to understand what had happened to her brother. Years later, Evelyn finally made her way into the asylum, bribing a guard who had been on his last shift before the facility's final closure. It was the night of a thunderstorm, the sky torn apart by flashes of jagged light. Rain lashed against the crumbling stone walls, the wind howling like a chorus of the damned. Evelyn moved through the shadowed corridors, her flashlight's beam slicing through the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of rot and mildew, the floors groaning beneath her every step, and all around her, the silence pressed in like a living thing. But worse than the silence were the voices that seemed to vibrate beneath it, soft, murmuring voices that spoke in broken syllables, voices that laughed and wept and pleaded. She found Daniel's room on the third floor, its door ajar, as if inviting her in. The room was small and bare, its walls stained with the kind of filth that seemed to seep from the stone itself. But on the far wall, etched in blood or rust or something worse, were words that made Evelyn's heart seize with terror. "They are not gone. We are not gone." She stumbled backward, the flashlight clattering to the floor. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she tried to steady herself. But the room felt alive, its air thick with a rage that had festered for years. Evelyn forced herself to leave, her senses fraying with every step. The building groaned and whispered as she made her way through the decaying corridors, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. But it was in the basement, where she had been warned never to go, that she found the final horror. The steps creaked as she descended, the darkness thickening like tar. The basement was a maze of cold stone and rusted metal, the walls sweating with a chill that seemed to cling to her skin. It was there, in the deepest bowels of the asylum, that Evelyn found the remains. Not just the broken bodies of those who had died within its walls, but something worse. Rows of hospital beds lined the chamber, their frames rusted and twisted. Some held the skeletal remains of patients who had been left to die, their bodies strapped down and forgotten. But others were different. Figures suspended in glass tanks, filled with a viscous dark fluid, their bodies preserved yet distorted, their eyes wide open and staring with an intensity that felt both alive and utterly, terrifyingly dead. The tanks were connected by a series of tubes and cables, the machinery humming softly as if still performing some arcane function. Notes were scattered across a nearby table, the writing manic and desperate. The scrawled words spoke of experiments meant to harness the soul, to transfer consciousness, to achieve true immortality. They spoke of breaking the barrier between life and death, of using madness as a key to unlocking some twisted vision of transcendence. Evelyn's scream tore through the darkness as she stumbled backward, her mind unraveling in the face of the truth. She fled the asylum that night, her sanity shattered beyond repair. In the years since, she has been committed to several institutions of her own. Her story, when she bothers to tell it, is dismissed as the ravings of a broken mind. But the notes she smuggled out of St. Dymphna, the scribbled theories and diagrams, still exist. And to those who dare to read them, one thing becomes horrifyingly clear. The patients of St. Dymphna Asylum may have died, But something else remains. Something that still roams those crumbling corridors, waiting for the curious and the desperate to step through its doors. But what truly chills the blood is this. No matter how many people go missing within its walls, the asylum never seems to grow empty. The haunted asylum where patients never left, the secret within. The notes Evelyn found were yellowed and crumbling, the ink smeared from what looked like water stains or tears. They detailed experiments conducted under the guise of behavioral therapy, but the true purpose was something far darker. According to the documents, the lead researcher, Dr. Victor Halloway, had become obsessed with the idea that madness was not simply a malfunction of the mind, but rather a doorway, a thin membrane separating the conscious world from a realm of pure chaos and suffering. And that membrane, he believed, could be breached. Patients considered too far gone to be rehabilitated were secretly transferred to the basement. Their minds broken, their sanity fractured into sharp, jagged pieces. To Dr. Halloway, they were the ideal subjects, individuals whose minds had already opened to the darkness he wished to study. The experiments had begun with hypnosis and sensory deprivation, but they quickly escalated into something far more insidious. Electroshock therapies combined with hallucinogenic drugs meant to push patients to the brink of death and then reel them back in. They were starved, beaten, isolated for weeks at a time, all in the name of research. But Dr. Halloway's fascination had not been with curing madness, it had been with what lay beyond it. His notes spoke of bridging the gap between the living and the dead, of using the mentally ill as vessels to reach into the unknown. And when the patients began to speak in voices not their own, when they started to describe creatures and places no living soul should ever know, he was convinced his theories were correct. He had opened a door, and something had stepped through. Evelyn continued reading, her hands trembling. Her own sanity felt fragile, fraying at the edges like old cloth, but she forced herself to read on, knowing the truth was the only thing left that mattered. The notes revealed that the asylum's closure had not been due to poor management or lack of funding. It had been a cover-up. By the time the state intervened, Dr. Halloway was gone, vanished without a trace, and the remaining staff had been silenced through bribes, threats, or worse. But the most horrifying revelation lay in the final pages, because according to Dr. Halloway's writings, the experiments had been successful. The asylum was not simply haunted by the spirits of those who had suffered within its walls. It had become a conduit, a place where the barriers between life and death had been permanently fractured. The things the patients had described, the shadowed figures, the voices that whispered from the darkness, were not hallucinations. They were real, and they were still there. Evelyn's flashlight flickered, the beam wavering as if caught in an unseen current. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around her with an almost physical force. And then for the first time, she heard it. A voice, low and broken, echoing from the depths of the chamber. A voice that spoke her brother's name. She stumbled backward, her mind torn between the desperate urge to flee and the crushing need to know the truth. What had they done to Daniel? What had they unleashed? The voices grew louder, merging into a cacophony of agony and rage. And within the clamor, she heard something else. A pleading, a call for help. Evelyn's knees buckled, her vision swimming with images she couldn't understand. Rooms melting into shadows, faces stretched and twisted beyond recognition, and always the whisper of her brother's name. Daniel, Daniel, Daniel. She had to leave. The asylum was not a place for the living, but her legs refused to move. Her body felt rooted to the spot, held in place by a force that was neither physical nor comprehensible. But then she saw it. Movement within one of the tanks, a hand, pale and skeletal, pressed against the glass from within. The fingers twitched, scraping softly against the surface. The eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto hers with a desperation that spoke of endless torment. And then the glass shattered. A scream tore itself from Evelyn's throat as she stumbled backward, the dark fluid splashing across the floor like blood. The figure within the tank collapsed, its body writhing and convulsing as if struggling to breathe air after an eternity submerged. But what crawled from the shattered remains was not her brother. It was something worse, something twisted and malformed, its flesh warped by whatever madness had been injected into its mind. It reached for her, its hands trembling, its mouth forming words that sounded both familiar and alien. Evelyn turned and ran, her steps echoing through the labyrinthine halls. The darkness chased her, the whispers clawing at her mind. She stumbled up the stairs, her vision blurring with tears and panic. The main doors loomed before her, half-rotted and splintered from years of neglect. She threw herself against them, her body crashing into the wood with a force driven by pure terror. And then she was outside, the icy rain lashing against her skin. But even as she stumbled into the night, she could still hear the voices, calling her name, calling her brother's name. St. Dymphna Asylum had taken everything from her, and it would never give it back. The haunted asylum where patients never left. The descent into madness. Evelyn ran until her lungs screamed and her legs threatened to buckle beneath her. The hallways twisted and coiled like a living thing, mocking her every turn with dead ends and corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. Her own footsteps echoed back at her, distorted and unnatural, as if the very walls were feeding her terror back to her. But she couldn't stop. Not with that thing still following her, its guttural wheezing and shambling movements a perverse parody of human life. The air itself was tainted, thick with the sour reek of decay and something older, something ancient and furious. She stumbled into the central wing, its high ceilings gaping like a mouth ready to devour her. The shattered remains of gurneys and rusted medical instruments littered the floor. Shadows swirled in every corner, but it was the sound that made her blood run cold. Voices, not the moaning of the tormented souls trapped within the asylum's walls, but the desperate murmurs of the living, pleading, screaming. Evelyn pressed her hands to her ears, her mind splintering under the weight of the sound. It was as if every victim of Dr. Holloway's experiments was speaking at once, their pain and rage merging into a symphony of madness. And yet beneath it all, she could still hear him, Daniel's voice, calling her name, begging her to help him. Tears blurred her vision as she pushed forward, her mind frantically searching for some kind of logic, some explanation for what was happening. This couldn't be real. It was a nightmare, a fevered hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But the pain in her chest, the chill in her bones, those were real enough. And the thing pursuing her was no figment of imagination. She found herself at the entrance to the basement, its gaping maw like the throat of some monstrous creature. The darkness beyond was absolute, but Daniel's voice rose from its depths, fragile and torn like a thread unraveling in the wind. "I'm here, Evelyn. Please, don't leave me." Against all reason, she descended the steps. Her flashlight flickered, the beam shivering as if it too was afraid of what lay ahead. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. and something else, something metallic and sharp. The hallway stretched before her, narrow and suffocating, the walls stained with blackened handprints and claw marks that spoke of desperate struggles. The floor creaked beneath her feet, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding with such ferocity she feared it would burst. But she pressed on, her brother's voice guiding her through the endless dark. Finally, she reached the chamber described in Dr. Holloway's notes. The room was vast and empty, the walls lined with broken machinery and glass tanks that glowed faintly with an unnatural luminescence. And in the center of the room stood a figure. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice fragile and hollow. He turned to face her, and for a moment she dared to hope. But the eyes that met hers were not Daniel's. They were empty, hollow pits, darkened by something unspeakable. His face was twisted, his features contorted, as if something else had taken root within him, warping his very essence. "Evelyn, you shouldn't have come here." The voice that spilled from his lips was broken, layered with tones both familiar and alien. "What did they do to you?" Evelyn sobbed, her body trembling with the horror of it all. "They opened the door. They let it in." His smile was a grotesque imitation of joy, his teeth stained and cracked. "It's too late now. For you, for me, for all of us." Evelyn's legs gave out, her knees slamming into the icy floor. The room began to twist and blur, the air thickening like molasses. "Daniel, I'm here. I can help you. Please." "No." His voice dropped to a whisper, his words strained as if fighting against something deep within. "You can't help me. You can only join me." The darkness around them pulsed, a living entity that seeped into her mind, clawing at her sanity. The echoes of the past, of all those who had suffered and died within these walls, converged upon her. And within their cries, she heard the truth. Dr. Holloway's experiments had succeeded. The asylum had become a vessel, a bridge between worlds, where the dead were not simply memories, but living nightmares. And now, she was part of it. Her own voice rose in a scream that tore through the silence, swallowed by the darkness that consumed her. And then, there was nothing. Only the whisper of her name, echoing endlessly through the cold, empty halls.